So welcome everyone to the August edition of the You Already Own It Cloud Office Hours. My name is Bob Ballard. I am the Principal Cloud Strategist here at Planet Technologies. We will be talking about Microsoft Teams today. So, we're going to start off with talking about Microsoft Teams and open it up to any of your questions. Feel free to type them in along the way. If you have some, I think I'm flying solo today, so I don't have anybody sitting on those questions. So just give me a minute to get to them if you do type them in while I'm presenting. So your You Already Own It team, myself, Bob Ballard, as well as my team spread across the country, Jerry Martin, Aaron Ward, George Scott, Scott Dowling, of course, Mary Tucker, that keeps us all in line and makes sure we live up to all our promises out there about delivering things on time and up to date. And it's all sponsored by the vision of our illustrious Vice President, Steve Winter. Please don't forget that if you do have further questions around this topic or any others along the way, that you can email the You Already Own It at go-planet.com alias, and that will be routed to the entire team. Our goal is to turn around with some sort of response to you within 24 hours. This is not the, hey, my environment's on fire, I have an emergency. But it is for the, hey, we've been thinking about deploying this or this, which order should we do it in? We've got some questions. Can you give us a hand? All of those kinds of things. Happy to help with those. And with that, we're going to kick it off with Microsoft Teams. So I don't want this session, and hopefully this meets your needs as well. I don't want this session to be, a demo of what Teams is about. I think most of us know what it is. I do want to talk about a couple of the pieces and the parts for a particular reason, because I think it's important to understand that we're not talking about a one-to-one mapping with Skype for Business. As most of you, I think, know, which is why I think there was definitely some interest in this topic. Microsoft has basically set an end of life for Skype for Business in the online Office 365 environment to be I believe it's June of 2020. So we are cruising along here to try to get that shut down. So I'm sorry, 2021. By the way, I don't want to scare the heck out of it. We have about 18 months. So with that in mind, we need to start getting this thing, putting a bow on this thing and start the migration, right? So what is Microsoft Teams, in case you don't know? I'm going to get into a little bit of that. Going to talk a little bit about sort of our methodology, about how we understand and sort of the process that we come in taking people towards Teams adoption, and then finally talk a little bit about some things in pertaining to the Skype for Business transition rather. So Microsoft Teams has four. Two main pillars, right? And then four sort of areas that Microsoft likes to focus on. So the two main pillars are, it's a communication tool, right? And in that way, it lines up to what Skype for Business was, right? I can do instant message and presence. I can extend that to be even persistent chat, right? So the ability to sort of post on a team wall or have chats that have a persistence to them. And then of course that extends to, more audio and voice related, like this is the Teams meeting we're attending today. So for meetings and calls and all of those things that we used to leverage for on Skype for Business. But on top of that, right, we have this collaboration side where Teams has sort of become the universal client for access to all things Office 365, except for mail, right? That's still the domain of Outlook. So deeply integrate with Office 365 applications. We can customize and extend these. This is another big area that I think is, certainly more unique to the Teams environment. And then the key here is that, all of these things are still abiding by the security and compliance and manageability that you expect on the back end. So, so as we go through this for a second, so we have the ability to communicate. Have the ability to communicate, have meetings, calls, and chats. As we we escalate into the collaboration side, you start to see things like persistent chat and the ability to create teams which have SharePoint on the back end, right? And then the ability to integrate with custom third-party and other Microsoft applications, right? So we're really Microsoft's been talking this talk track for a long time on a number of products, but for the first time ever, I'm starting to see it really be adopted, right? Hey, we can integrate Teams tabs in with, to have connections to Trilio or LinkedIn or you know a number of other sort of development products, SurveyMonkey, all these kinds of things. Just things like Twitter, right? So let's say part of my role is in fact that I am the communications team for a city or a state or a particular agency or department. We can actually see what the traffic and mentions and things like that on social media is about us or about the Twitter handle and all those things literally right in a singular client, right? So there's a lot of interesting scenarios there. But the key here is that, this is a foundational element of, a foundational element of what was already in Office 365. And the analogy that I like to make, and again, I'm just trying to frame so we make sure we all understand exactly what this thing is or isn't before we get into some of the adoption methodologies. As we start to think through this, there's been a lot of comparisons, for instance, between Teams and Slack. You see every industry analysis article that gets posted out of there. It's, Microsoft skating on Slack with Teams and this, that, and the other thing. But the one big inherent difference, and the thing that Microsoft got right around Teams that I think is one of the things that's potentially holding Slack back from broad adoption. So number one, Microsoft Teams is built on top of existing technologies that are already in Office 365. So in the Slack world, I am either a participant or a non-participant. In the Teams world, I can participate and interact with these documents. The back end of what Teams is really just SharePoint, right? So what does that mean? And why I'm bringing up in this particular bullet point about working with confidence is whatever security policies, whatever DLP policies, whatever whatever kinds of analysis and security and compliance elements you have placed in, data leakage protection, et cetera, information rights management, all of those things can be applied to the product. It also means that if I have not discovered the Teams train, at least initially, I can still interact with these folks by directly interacting with SharePoint and still be able to participate in collaboration on documents. So, communicate much like we did with Skype for Business. The ability to do threaded persistent chat is new, right? And contextual. And what that means is having the idea that we have teams with topics or, specific departmental emphasis, et cetera, that we can have texts, we can have persistent chats around that. I can have, of course, standard private chats, right? I at this point now at Planet Technologies, I only have a Teams client. So I'm taking all the presence and IM stuff that I was doing with Skype for Business and leveraging it in Teams, as well as all of these other things. So, as we're talking about collaborating with the integrated Office 365, again, I think the important piece here is, I can take, so I'll use Yammer as an example of as far as the difference about this experience, right? So if I took, so one of the questions I used to get with customers all the time, right, was, okay, so I have SharePoint and I have Yammer and I have this and I have that, and I just don't understand what I'm supposed to do with which, right? So, because one of the things you could do in a Yammer persistent conversation or persistent chat was I could take a document and I could upload it into the persistent chat and people could look at it, and it makes sense, right? We're talking back and forth. Hey, I need to understand what the, what the root cause analysis is for this problem, and we're talking back and forth, and somebody says, help, here's the document that tells you, and they post it. So in the Yammer world, that was just a document. It didn't have any of the, it was sitting in that persistent chat. We could all interact with it, but on the back end, it was not SharePoint. So I couldn't do simultaneously editing the document. I didn't have the same sort of compliance and audit capabilities that I might have, et cetera. When I take a document in Teams and I upload it to the chat, persistent chat, it actually is storing that document in a SharePoint library and applying all the same compliance elements to that. So the ability to customize and extend, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I encourage you to sort of look out there to understand there are other applications that you might be using in your environment that can integrate. The idea behind Teams and its use case scenario is that theoretically I can crack open my Teams client. I can get to all the, I can interact with the people that I interact with most. I can get to the sites, that has, my documents and content in it the most. And theoretically, I can also get bits and pieces of information for other third-party applications brought into a singular landing place, right? So that's sort of the dream there. We sort of beat to death, I think, the concept of how it's, it's leveraging what's already in Office 365 and just built upon it. So Microsoft Teams becomes the core communications client, both my primary way that I'm doing all the things I used to do for Skype for Business, but also the way that I'm interacting with content, right? Probably more so as you start to shift to a Teams-centric world, the stuff is still sitting in SharePoint Online. Things are still out there, in those same areas. But now I'm actually interacting and accessing it through a client. It's almost like Teams is becoming the Office 365 client, not just the communications client. It is taking Skype for Business backend and infrastructure that's already built into there and just creating a new client experience, and then obviously being upgraded and updated on top of that, right? So all of the lessons learned and the performance and the experience, et cetera, that we had with Skype for Business, that's still there. They have not changed the backend infrastructure. And then the ability to, to leverage sort of the intelligent cloud behind there to have a stronger experience around calls and meetings. So just a few things to talk about. Teams was not developed as an on-premises product and then grown into a cloud services product. It was known from the very beginning that that's the way it was going to be. So it's sort of leveraged and was designed to handle that infrastructure from the beginning there, right? Very high, resilient infrastructure, et cetera, to accomplish that. So there's some really interesting things here. There's a few things, particularly in Teams, that I think improve the experience, and I'll just leave you with this, and then we'll sort of get into the nitty-gritty about some of the areas I want to talk about. The Hollywood Squares style of viewing of of video. So one of the things, many of you guys know I'm an ex-Microsoft employee. I was there for 14 years, and some of the time that I was there, I ran what was the live communication server and the office communication server team for state and local government. And one of the things that people used to always ask for was a view similar to what you see on this slide, which is how can I get 4 people into a view all at one time and flip-flop them up there. So some of these kinds of UI-based experiences have been addressed, to sort of improve some of that. The other thing that I'll tell you that from someone who has to record this call every month, for instance, and then share it out with the marketing team, et cetera, some really interesting scenarios, like the native saving place for all of your team recordings is Stream. So inherently, I am taking the recordings and I'm storing in a place where they can be where the content can be indexed. You can actually get transcriptions of all of that so they can be searched for content. So one of the examples I always use, I think is really fascinating, is so how many times have you guys had a series of calls, that you did? They were, on Skype or in person or whatever they are. The idea is if you can take those meetings and start recording them and storing them, particularly if they're planning meetings, et cetera, then when somebody says, who was it that said, I know somebody said there was an application that could take care of this problem, or that there was a partner that knew how to do this, or that there was a feature, or they read an article that talked about exactly what the problem we're experiencing. Well, if I'm taking my meetings and I'm recording them, and by default, I'm storing them into Stream with just the people that were invited to the meetings having access to them by default, right? Unless I change that. So I'm taking those and storing them into Stream. Then I can index them, search them. So I can go back and say, who talked about this product? I can search in those meetings. It will take me right to the place where that came up in our call, right? So there's really powerful sort of next step things that are happening in those meetings. So why did I just take 15 minutes-ish or so and go through what teams are when I think many of you probably already know? So I wanted to make sure we all knew everything. But I think the important lesson here is that, so we often talk about this as, hey, we're getting ready to transition from one product to another. So when you go from SharePoint 2007 to SharePoint 2010, right? While there were many things that changed, essentially the product did the same thing and the next version did the same thing with improvements, right? And when you talk about this across the board, this tends to be true. The thing that I want to stress enough is Teams is not a one-to-one match for Skype for Business. It does a lot more. And why does this matter? Well, there's not a big governance question around Skype for Business, right? So in other words, what I mean by that is, hey, we don't really store content. I don't need to worry about, I'm not concerned about the life cycle of Skype for Business around that. In general, when we think about the original core workloads of Office 365, right, Skype for Business was the easy one, right? It wasn't really storing content. We didn't have to worry about that kind of stuff. There wasn't a whole bunch of security or compliance concerns. Yes, there are some. Do I invite external parties, et cetera? But there wasn't much. Well, suddenly we've taken this and layered on an element where I have to start thinking about who is going to have the ability to create teams on the collaboration side, kind of going back to who has the ability to create team sites in SharePoint, right? Who did you allow to create groups, right? What happens when they're unused for a period of time? Is there an automated process? Am I leveraging that? How am I going to have a naming convention for these teams if I'm going to allow the masses to create it? I've even had customers say, we're going to allow the masses to create it, but we're going to make them watch a video on sort of the rules for creating teams in my environment. And so they need to open a ticket in ServiceNow that says, I want to make teams. It points them to the video. When they've completed it, I will provision them to allow them to be able to make teams. These are all things we need to think about that we didn't need to think about at all with Skype for Business, because of that entirely secondary piece of the puzzle. So as a result, right, this is sort of the process that we think about in Teams deployments, envisioning, readiness, adoption, whichever word you want to stick in to use today, right? So one piece of it is platform envisioning, right? Like, what can this thing do? Let's listen about your use cases. How are you using Skype today? How are you using SharePoint today? How are you using OneDrive today? All those things get put in together and say, where does Teams fit in this scenario? And maybe that's different from department to department, agency to agency, et cetera, right? So, how am I going to use it? How does it fit? What's the process? Then it becomes, okay, there's Skype's to Teams migration planning. or there's greenfield migration planning, and those are different, right? How would I deploy this if I didn't have, I haven't deployed Skype for Business, so I'm just starting fresh. What do I do? I have Skype for Business. I need to develop a migration plan to get from one to the other in a comprehensive way. Secondarily, finally, on this piece of the planning and governance is you need to have governance workshops to understand. Now, whether you're doing them internally or you're leveraging someone like Planet to do so, you need to understand who can make teams, what is their life cycle process, what are the naming conventions, all those things. How is it handled out of the box? Are there things that I can do aside from that to improve those experiences? Because you can quickly have an explosion of teams, and once the cat is out of the box, it can be difficult to put it back in, right? So then from sort of the planning and governance side, we get into implementation. This is pretty obvious, right? Hey, let's take these settings that come from the planning, put them in the tenant, and we can do a pilot and broader deployment. The main thing I want to talk about here is the organizational change management. So more so than almost any product, Teams has the capability to be truly transformative in the way that your users are using Office 365, right? They really can take certain processes, certain work paradigms that have always been true, were email centric, were, some other things, and possibly flip that on its ear. Now, I'm not saying you need to, but I am saying that many organizations are looking at this, and users are finally going, yep, I get it. That makes sense to me. I want to take this further. And if you're going to radically transform their environment, right, you really need to take a look at organizational change management. So quickly, just to build it out for a second so it's easier, I'll move it up so it's a little easier to see. The point is we can go from planning and governance, do the organizational change management, and then implementation, or the other way around. But there are things like teamwork assessment. Forget about the product. How are people in your organization working together in teams today? Look at those end user use cases and develop them, right? So that you understand how they're going to be used. You are not going to be successful in a real transformation on Teams unless you get your communications planning right and your end user adoption tools right. Whether they're, this is stuff that's coming from Planet, or this is stuff that you're developing inside and internally on your own or using another partner, whatever the answer to that might be, you have to nail that story, right? We are not going to change the way that we interact with almost everything if we don't get organizational change management. And I can tell you, I'm going to talk about this towards the end, but there are funding programs available for Microsoft. And for the first time, and I was at Microsoft for 14 years, I've been at Planet for 5, almost 20 years of being, deeply integrated with the Microsoft way. Organizational change management is one of the elements for both Windows 10 and Teams programs that they have. They actually have add-ons for organizational change management, right? So in other words, there's extra funding to take care of this particular use, right? And I can tell you, I've never seen that before. So I think, to me, that sort of leads you down the path that of course, the industry's changing, right? We used to just shove things down end users' throats a lot of times, right? But on top of that, I think it means specifically on these particular cases, these changes are so radical that we should develop a plan. So just really quickly to make sure that we're covering sort of, another element. So when we look at the transition to Teams from Skype for Business, right, we want to make sure that this transition is smooth. We don't need to do it all at once, right? So, you can make sure you pull the trigger after you come in. Do that. If we go back to the previous slide here, hold on. If we go back to the previous slide for a second, we can do the platform envisioning, we can do some planning, we can do the governance workshops, we can do some of this organizational change management things, and then pilot an organization and go forward, right? We might have teams out there, but for example, at Planet, still to this day, outside of the pilot group, right, we actually have we have Skype for Business enabled and Teams enabled at the same time in the organization. I have actually been transitioned and I am only on Teams. So I need to be able to interact with people that are on Skype for Business. I need to be able to, so that I can have a desktop sharing session so they can join my meetings, et cetera. All of that needs to still be able to happen along the way. So it's important to think that you get that interoperability right. So there are provisions that are in there, but secondarily, the reason why people hang on, I just want to leave you with a few things. The reason why people hang on, you need to, the technology needs to be able to handle things like reoccurring meetings. So the reason why I think, without understanding how it works, the reason why many people at Planet Technologies are hanging on to Skype for Business is, hey, I have 6 calls that are like once a week that are ongoing forever, and I don't want to go back and have to deal with changing all those. Well, in the transition workflow, Teams will automatically convert all of those reoccurring Skype for Business meetings into Teams meetings. Right. So there's a number of ways to sort of ease that process, make it, pick a couple of, groups at a time. You still get full interoperability. And when I say full, the key things still work as you have desired. Right. And then, I can attend meetings. I can call it. We can call each other. We can screen share across, et cetera, within the organization. And you need to make sure all of that stuff will still work to get the story nailed down. So there's really sort of, and I don't know that we have anybody on here, but there's really 2 main things we have to think about, right? So if I'm all online, story's pretty straightforward, right? You need to be able to, Teams users need to be able to communicate whether they're on Skype for Business or Teams. Skype for Business Online and Teams users need to call or chat across the apps, right? I need to be able to call somebody. I need to be able to chat. It needs to be able to work. Prior to me making the switch to Teams at Planet, Planet is federated with Microsoft. We obviously work with the Microsoft account teams all the time. So we were regularly, Microsoft is 100% converted over to Teams. So, we needed to be able to still communicate using Skype for Business with our federated Microsoft partners, for instance. That was happening every day. We could still make calls, all of those things, right? So it's a little more complicated if you actually have a hybrid Skype for Business on-prem. This is particularly something that rears its head when we have customers that are leveraging, significant voice capabilities potentially out of Skype, and they may have some on-premises infrastructure still in place today. But it still can be achieved where we can have Skype for Business Online, and Teams all interacting with each other in a hybrid way. Right, Teams is talking to Skype for Business Online. The federation with the on-premise Skype for Business will be brokered. So I can have somebody in Teams IMing with somebody with an on-premises account. So before I shift into sort of the closing stuff on this, are there any questions out there? Do you guys have any questions? Everybody's really quiet today. Going once. Going twice. Okay, I got a couple more slides to finish up with, and then obviously if you think of something between now and then, feel free to chime in, and I'm happy to answer. So as I jokingly say at the end, this particular presentation on Teams was brought to you by Azure Advantage, but there's also Office 365 advantages as well, right? So that's access to the ability to sort of rent an architect and/or hands-on everyday day-to-day management of your environment. And while there's definitely use cases for the hands-on management of the environment, we're really seeing customers be very interested in how can I have access to the knowledgeable subject matter experts at Planet on a regular basis in both a reactive and proactive manner, without having to, have a contract where I'm paying for them 40 hours a week, 4 weeks a month, 12 months a year, right? So leveraging Azure Advantage, Office 365 Advantage, you have the ability to do both reactive and proactive interactions with an architect, all the way down to hands-on management of your environment. So if you have any questions or interest in that, please feel free to reach out to your Planet account team. And with that, I'm gonna wrap it up. Sort of short and sweet today. This is the third time we've covered this topic, but I wanted to drive a couple things home. By the way, there is one last thing I want to leave you, and I don't want to let anybody go until I've kind of got this out. There are absolutely significant Microsoft funding programs targeted for teams this year. So regardless, so anywhere from a smallish organization has some sort of funding mechanisms. If your organization is a larger organization, several thousand users and above, there could be significant funding available for you to help enable, deploy, and get through some of these hurdles, right? Take that slide that I had with the sort of work streams that it takes to get teams enabled, the organizational change management, the implementation, the planning and governance, and target some elements of that to get you over the hump and what's required to get you through the knothole. With that, any questions? All right. I want to thank everybody for attending. Everybody have a great Labor Day weekend, and we'll see you next month.